I always lump these together with the Grimer line. I mean, yeah, the Kanto region does have a lot of poison types in it, but a lot of them are more natural. Plenty of the poison types are also grass types, and even those that aren't, like the Ekans line, are still biological creatures. They fit into the ecosystem pretty neatly. That's not the case for the Grimer line, they feel very artificial. And that's also the case for these Pokemon. If you look at them, they really don't have any similarities to anything else in nature, except for others that seem more artificial than natural. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the floating gas ball Koffing and its noxious evolution wheezing. Let's start off with saying that these aren't hollow. I know there are plenty of rumors and popular art that depicts these as being completely empty on the inside, but that's just not the case. I mean, if they were nothing more than a balloon filled with noxious gases, then they wouldn't even be classified as alive, let alone a being that's able to eat, move, and think on its own accord. No, they have organs and whole internal biological systems that allow them to function, which we will get further into later on in the guide. For now, you only have to know that Koffing is a purple sphere that's covered in different craters across its skin, through which it excretes poisonous gases. Instead of rolling along on the ground like a Voltorb, it floats above the ground, using an internal gas bladder to float. It also has 2 eyes and a mouth, as well as tan skin markings in the shape of a skull and crossbones. Which does make me wonder if we got that symbol from Koffing, or if it was a simple coincidence in nature. Thanks to the gases it keeps inside its body, they weigh much less than they look like they should, only coming in at about 2 pounds or 1 kilogram. They're also 2 feet, or 0.6 meters, in diameter as well, so not tiny by any means. Upon evolution, or through a form of mutation that we'll talk about in a bit, Koffing will evolve into a wheezing. It honestly looks like one of those that's just multiples of its pre-evolution stuck together, like Magneton or Dugtrio, but things went wrong. One of the Koffing's heads is much bigger than the other, with there also being a smaller, undeveloped third sphere with no face attached to both of the others through tubes. In all, not that drastic of a change. They do increase in size though, now being an average of nearly 4 feet tall, or 1.2 meters. Funny enough, since they are still being held aloft by the gases, they still weigh a lot less than you think they would, only being an average of about 21 pounds, or 9.5 kilograms. And I should mention, before we move on, that these are absolutely one of the poison types that you need to get permission to keep. Thankfully, they aren't as bad as the Grimer line on the ecosystem, but the gases that they create and expel from their bodies are well known to be mildly toxic, causing coughing, irritation, and sore throats through breathing it in. They can be a major health risk to people if they get loose in an urban setting, and to that length, many governments have set up regulations that restrict how many of these you can have at once, where and how you have to house them, and the regulations they have to follow to be allowed to keep these Pokemon. We'll get further into the details in the Enclosure section, but for now just know that to keep these Pokemon, you will need your local government's permission to do so. And if you decide to not follow these rules, then you're liable to be fined and the Pokemon confiscated from you. And nobody wants a Pokemon that they've cared for and grown to love taken away from them because they didn't have the correct documentation to house them. With that warning out of the way, let's finally get into it and see if these gassy Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Your main thing that you want to think of when it comes to these guys is containing the gases. And to that end, you want to contain the Pokemon completely. We're going to be making a fully enclosed enclosure, where the walls are made of non-porous, non-breathable material. Whether that be PVC plastic, metal, glass, or another material. Personally, I prefer concrete enclosure as it provides a decent strength to the walls without being unduly heavy or expensive. It won't provide the best view of your Pokemon, but as you'll soon learn, that's not such a bad thing when it comes to these guys. Also, these Pokemon have been known to blow themselves up like the Voltorb line does, thanks to the fact that their gases can be flammable in high quantities. So the concrete walls will help to contain those if it does happen. Thankfully, they don't do it nearly as much or to the lengths that the Voltorb line does, so you shouldn't have to worry about that happening too much. You will need quite a bit of space, however, as these Pokemon do move around quite a bit just through floating. You're looking at a space that's roughly 25 by 25 feet for a Koffing and 40 feet by 40 feet for a wheezing, with the ceiling being 15 feet tall on both enclosures. That's 7.5 meters for Koffing, 12.1 meters for wheezing, and both being about 4.5 meters tall. It might seem small, but you have to remember that these are floating, so they're able to make use of the entire space, not just the floor. Like aquatic Pokemon in a fish tank. During the construction, you should also install all of the usual necessary things when we put in an enclosure like this. Lighting, a door for you to enter and exit through, and you can even put in windows if you like. Thanks to these guys not exploding with the force or frequency of the Voltorb line, then it's much less likely for them to shatter those windows. One thing you do have to make sure of is that the windows are sealed tight. If there is even one leak where the gases can escape into the surrounding environment and an inspector finds that leak, you will be staring down the barrel of some major fines. Which reminds me, make sure all of the lights are sealed off from the internal air of the enclosure. With the gases being flammable in higher quantities, you don't want to have the electricity from the lights coming on and causing an unfortunate explosion. Speaking of the gases, one of the biggest differences to this enclosure as opposed to others of its kind is the ventilation system that you'll need. One, of course you'll have a way for fresh air to get in, after all the Pokemon does need to breathe, but the more important part is the outflow. Like I said, the gases that these Pokemon emit are not great for the surrounding air quality, and if you just release them into the surrounding air, then not only are you poisoning the surrounding air for you and any other people and Pokemon that are nearby, you will get hit with a big fine just for doing so. But you can't just leave the gases in the enclosure to build up over time. That's not good for the Pokemon at all, as they can't even breathe or function in areas where their gases get too concentrated. It's a waste product after all, and last I checked, we can't survive in an environment of our own waste product, so it makes sense that they wouldn't be able to survive in theirs either. Sure, they can survive a bit of their own gas in their surrounding atmosphere, but not if you let it build up too much. So filtering the air is good for your Pokemon. And if you let the gases build up too much, you're going to be essentially making a bomb. Like I said, their gases are flammable, and if you let it build up to high concentrations in the environment and one of your Pokemon decides to self-destruct, then you'll have a much larger and much more dangerous boom going on your hands. All that to say that an air filtration system is very important for these guys. The issue comes with how complex of a system that you'll need. Separating out certain gases from the air isn't an easy thing, and is much harder to do than filtering something out of water. What you're going to need is a system of 3 chambers, all designed to pull more and more of the gases out of the air that passes through them. The first chamber is going to be your regular old filter. As the air gets pulled through it, the filter will trap some of the larger particulates and a few of the smaller bits that pass through it. Think of it like the air filter in your car. After that, the next chamber will be full of activated charcoal. This chamber is used to trap anything microbiotic and any heavy metals that are still in the air. From here, it'll get pushed through to the last chamber, which will be full of flowing salt water. Here, the water and salt should help trap the rest of whatever is left in the air from the gases. At that point, the air coming out the other end should be clean enough. It won't be perfect, fresh air that you want to sniff out of the exhaust, but it will be within environmental regulations so you avoid any fines and won't be toxic enough to really affect the surrounding air. At least, not terribly. The major pain with this system is the maintenance that you have to do with it, but we'll cover that more in the care section. Your other option to this is to have a system that pulls in and traps the air in large canisters, compressing it and storing it, and then you have someone come in to exchange the tank for a new empty one. The major issue that I see with this system is that it can easily get very expensive to constantly have someone show up to exchange the tanks, and of course the danger of, once the tanks are full of compressed gas, an explosive hazard. The filter system, while needing more maintenance and more upfront cost, just seems the better, safer option in my mind. Lastly, let's talk about any Pokemon that could be housed with them. I'm sure, surprising nobody, there aren't that many that can be put in the same space as these guys. Like with the Grimer evolution, putting anything that needs to breathe in the same area as the Koffing line is going to end badly. Even many of the less organic Pokemon lines who don't need to breathe might not be a good idea. Just a few examples are the Magnemite line, as the electricity could set the gases off, or the Baltoy line, as with their psychic abilities, if they attack your Koffing evolution, it's not going to end well there either. It might just be best to avoid any other species, which brings us to talking about other Koffing evolutions. They will get along if you put the evolutions together. Just be sure that you expand the enclosure to accommodate them. They aren't the kind of Pokemon that form large colonies with each other, and therefore each individual needs their own space away from the others. I will say, though we aren't going to be talking anymore about the Galarian form of wheezing, putting them together with a regular wheezing is really effective. Galarian wheezing actually pulls in toxins and releases clean air, unlike regular wheezing. This means that getting one of them housed with your regular Koffing evolution will be incredible. You'll still need the air cleaning system, as that's just part of the government regulations, but getting a Galarian wheezing will greatly decrease the need to maintain the system, as it won't be working nearly as hard. While not necessary, I greatly encourage anyone that wants to get one of the Cantonian variety of these Pokemon to also get a Galarian version at the same time. Availability. Unsurprisingly, these Pokemon are most often found in places that have a terrible air quality. Urban, human places that are full of pollutants are great places to find these Pokemon, like the Burn Tower in Johto or the Verbank Complex in Unova. This also used to include the old rundown mansion that was situated on Cinnabar Island, but as with most things on the island, that was destroyed when the volcano erupted. Speaking of volcanoes, they often show up in places like Stark Mountain in Sinnoh, the Fiery Path in Hoenn, and around the city of Motostoke in Galar, though keep in mind that's only going to be Koffing. You won't find Cantonian wheezing there at all. Kitakami also has a small Koffing population that lives on Oni Mountain in the center of the island. And I should say that the Koffing line is very plentiful in these places. It's very easy to run into them if you happen to go to any of them. As for the breeding industry, these Pokemon aren't that popular for breeders to get into. Thanks to all the government hoops they have to jump through to get approved to even keep one of these Pokemon, setting up a breeding facility for them can be a nightmare. Especially when you have to consider that breeders are either going to need to massively increase the size of their enclosure, which means more expensive air filtration systems, or create multiple enclosures, which also means more expensive air filtration systems. And also, there's just not that much of a market for these guys. Very few people out there are willing to buy them, which means there are fewer people trying to sell them. As well, there is a slight stigma attached to raising these Pokemon, like people look at you like you want to poison their air, even though you're doing everything to keep the toxic gases from escaping the enclosure. There really isn't an incentive to raise these Pokemon. The only exception to this is the wheezing market in Galar. Thanks to the fact that Galarian wheezing helps to keep the air free of pollutants, the Galarian government likes to try and keep their population up. The only reason that I'm mentioning that here is because that means there are people that raise Koffing in Galar. They're just government workers, and the whole purpose of the ranch there is to not release them until they evolve. So, if you want a Koffing, then you're either going to have to hunt really hard for a private seller that you can get one from, or go through the bureaucracy of the Galarian government and your local government to hopefully get a Koffing from a government breeder. Getting a hold of one of these guys is not going to be easy. Catchability. Just like everything else that we've talked about with these Pokemon, the biggest thing that you have to think about when you go out to catch one is the environment. Like I said in the availability section, every place that these Pokemon are found in the wild is a hazardous environment, so be careful when you go into them. If you're going to one of the urban environments, be sure that you have permission to enter first, and follow any rules or regulations that are laid out for that area. And if you plan on going into one of the more natural environments to hunt for them, then always be prepared. I'm talking breathing apparatus, protective clothing, a first aid kit, everything. Also, be sure that someone knows where you are going, when you will be there, and when you're supposed to get back, and what Pokemon you'll be taking with you. Again, these places are full of poisonous fumes and extreme temperatures. You can't be too careful when it comes to hunting there. As for the best Pokemon for you to take with you, ground types are probably the best. They're unaffected by the vast majority of poison type moves and are super effective against poison in turn. Though, it's also worth mentioning, thanks to their levitate ability, ground type moves often don't have an effect on Koffing. Barring ground types, your best types would be steel types or psychic types, as they both have advantages against poison types. And when you actually go to catch a Koffing, I would say to use a Pokeball or a Great Ball for the Koffing, and a Great Ball or Ultra Ball for the wheezing. Care. One thing that I haven't mentioned at all in this guide so far is how these Pokemon eat. And that's because what they eat isn't that pleasant. See, these Pokemon are actually a form of filter feeder. Now, normally, filter feeders are aquatic, as it's a lot more common for water to have things suspended in it than air, and like I mentioned with the filter systems, it's a lot easier to filter things out of water than it is to filter things out of air. Be that as it may, the Koffing line is one of the very rare air filter feeders. They feed on other fumes that can be found in the air. This is why they are so often found in places that have noxious air in the wild, like volcanoes or industrial parks. That's also why they are often found hovering around trash and garbage, because the smell and fumes that rotting garbage makes is perfect for their feeding. And so, feeding them is going to mean leaving uncovered, decomposing garbage in the air enclosure so they can feed off the fumes that come off of it. I'm not saying that you should just throw garbage into the enclosure. You could do that, but I really don't recommend it, as it just makes the entire enclosure a mess. Instead, I recommend that you get a couple of garbage cans for your house, about 3 of them. Then, start filling them one at a time, the way you normally would. The only thing that you're going to do here that's slightly weird is not use a garbage bag, as a lot of normal bags hold in and constrain the smell and fumes that come off your garbage. So, when the first garbage can is full, you wheel it into your Koffing's enclosure, and pull the lid off and leave it there. That's it, really. You don't have to worry about amounts for these Pokemon, as the fumes coming off the garbage aren't going to run out at all. And if you leave the can in the enclosure for the Pokemon, then you don't have to worry about a feeding schedule at all. It's really an easy, yet gross, method of feeding. However, I don't recommend leaving the garbage there indefinitely. It's going to start to decompose and rot, and then it's a health risk to your Pokemon once it reaches a certain point. Remember, they only eat the fumes coming off the garbage. Any bacteria that grows on the garbage could still possibly infect your Pokemon. Realistically, you want to change out the garbage fairly regularly, which is where the other cans come in. Once you move one of the cans into the enclosure, start to fill up another one. Then, when that second one gets full, move that into the enclosure, pull the first one out, and set it out for the garbage men to come and take away. This is why I recommended having 3 cans. That way you can have one at the curb for the garbage men, one in the enclosure with your Pokemon, and then the last one that you're currently filling. And then you continue the rotation. One thing I should mention with this is that you might want to check with your local regulations regarding garbage pickup. Some of them may have rules regarding unbagged garbage, meaning you might end up with the unpleasant task of having to rebag all of the garbage that you had sitting in the Koffing's enclosure. Nowhere near a pleasant job, I know, but if you're not willing to handle the garbage, then I'd have to say that these Pokemon might not be the best fit for you. Which brings us to cleaning. A big part of caring for these Pokemon is going to be maintenance and cleaning of their enclosure and other things, like the filtration system. Over time, you'll have to open up the filtration system and clean out all the gross material that's been filtered out over time. When you do this, be sure that you're wearing full body protection, as it's going to be full of toxins that have built up over time. You especially want to cover up your eyes and protect your airways, as those will be the areas that will be most heavily affected by the toxins. The first chamber should be the easiest for you to deal with. It's a simple filter that you pull out and replace with a fresh one, much like the air filters in your car again. The charcoal will similarly be a simple switch out, though you may want to scrub the insides of the holding tank. Charcoal has a habit of leaving a coating on everything it touches, and if you don't clean out the tank, then that residue can build up over time and clog the system. If you just wipe it out every time you change the charcoal, then that should prevent that from becoming an expensive issue to fix. The same will have to be done with the salt water. This is the part that you have to be extra careful with. Since it's in liquid form, it's very easy to not keep track of all of it and for it to get into your body. Drain the water from the tank, and after it's empty, clean the inside of the tank well with fresh water and soap. This isn't only to get rid of any lingering toxins, but also to break up any salt that's sticking to the inside of the tank. As anyone who has to drive on roads that have been salted for the winter knows, salt eats away at everything it comes into contact with. So as you're scrubbing away on the inside, be sure to check the integrity of the tank. If you see any places where the metal is starting to corrode or the seal is starting to break down, then you should get on replacing that immediately. After that, once you're done cleaning and checking the tank, refill it with fresh salt water, and you should be done. As for all the contaminated material that you just pulled out, it'll have to be placed in appropriate biohazard waste disposal units, and you'll have to contact a company that's certified to get rid of it. Thanks to its toxic nature, you can't just throw it away in your normal garbage. And if anyone notices you doing it, then you're going to be hit with some, let's say it with me, hefty fines. Which brings me to the regular inspections that you're going to have to go through. Thanks to their noxious existence, no offense to the Pokemon, you're going to need to constantly have environmental safety regulators come out to your property to inspect the enclosure and make sure that it and the Pokemon are being cared for correctly. The frequency of these visits depends on region and local laws, but if the inspector finds something wrong about your enclosure or your care for the Pokemon, then they can cite you with anything from a warning to a fine to having your Pokemon confiscated and your license to raise them revoked. If you want to keep these Pokemon, then it is vital that you prioritize scheduling and passing these inspections, which is what a lot of the cleaning is about. Another thing that you're going to have to clean regularly are the garbage cans that you're using for food. I know it seems weird that you're going to be cleaning the cans just to fill them back up with trash for the Pokemon, but it's important to do so. Like I said, any harmful bacteria that grows on the garbage can easily harm your Pokemon, so you have to keep the cans clean so that your garbage doesn't get dirty. I know, that didn't sound like it made any sense. Look at it like this. Don't think of the garbage cans as garbage cans. Instead, think of them as really big food dishes, and the garbage that you're throwing out as the food. With any other Pokemon, you wouldn't want to feed them out of a dirty dish, would you? Of course not. It would lead to them getting really sick. It's much the same thing here. If you let the cans get too gross, then it can be just as bad as feeding a regular Pokemon out of a dirty dish. And honestly, that's it when it comes to the care for these guys. You won't really be interacting with them too much, considering they create an atmosphere that is hazardous to your health. So long as you have the correct equipment on, you should be able to go inside the enclosure for small amounts of time. They are friendly to humans, and you can even form a decent bond with them over time. Just be sure not to spend too much time in the enclosure. Long-term exposure, even with all the correct protections in place, could be bad for your health. And if you ever feel any discomfort while in the enclosure, then you should leave it immediately and double-check all of your equipment. Your health is vitally important, and whatever you're doing in the enclosure, I'm sure can wait for you to figure out the issue and correct it. Cost. The enclosure is going to cost quite a bit of money, especially when you consider that you have to get the filtration system in place. That, in and of itself, is going to shoot the price way up. And then, when you look at all the rest of the stuff that you have to build, like the actual building, it's really no surprise that you're going to be spending in the very high category here. Food is going to be on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, it's not like you're going to go out to buy garbage. People make garbage just by living their everyday lives. If you are spending any money on this, then I have to assume that you either have a bunch of these Pokemon and don't make enough garbage to sustain them, or you somehow live an impossible garbage-free lifestyle that nobody else has figured out, which, in that case, congratulations. But, yeah, I suppose this would be in the very low category out of default. The Pokemon itself will probably be in the high category. Sure, it's not that popular, which is why the price isn't sky high, but the very fact that you have to take all these precautions thanks to how toxic the Pokemon is, means that the breeder is going to try to recoup some of that cost in the price of the Pokemon. After all, dangerous and tricky Pokemon are always going to cost more to house than Pokemon that you can safely keep in your house. Conclusion. I really don't see how these could be a Pokemon that you want to have. Between the toxic gas that they put off, the fact that you have to feed them literal garbage, and then clean that garbage out, and all the regulation BS they get to jump through just to keep them seems like it would be a deal breaker for almost anyone. Nobody less than an expert should keep these Pokemon. Someone who is very used to handling Pokemon that are tricky and dangerous to be around. Their friendly demeanor is really their only saving grace, but even then, you can't interact with them without major protections for you. If you don't have at least a decade or two of experience, then I'm sorry, but I don't see how these would be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the hard-headed, rock-charging Pokemon Rhyhorn and its evolutions Rhydon and Rhyperior. Have a wonderful night, everyone.